When a crime is committed, the perpetrator inevitably leaves behind something, a description, DNA, or physical evidence. This is the criminal's print on the scene. Welcome to the Criminal Prints Podcast, Episode 13.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Criminal Prints Podcast. This is Zach.
And this is your co-host, Jaron.
Thank you very much for joining us. We're glad to have you. Today, we're going to be talking about the disappearance of Danielle Imbo and Richard Patron Jr. And Jaron, I'm sure you will agree, this is an extremely unusual disappearance. So, normally when disappearances happen, the person is alone. A second person, in my opinion, adds a lot of protection from injury, abduction, or assault. But in this case, two people with seemingly clean lives both disappear.
And with them, a huge piece of evidence literally also disappeared. But before we can really get into the details of this case, we need to talk about Danielle Embo and Richard Petrone. Because we're talking about two people, we'll stick to the pertinent information as much as possible.
Danielle Imbo was 34 years old at the time of her disappearance. She was 5 foot, 5 inches tall, and 175 pounds. She had hazel eyes, brown hair, and fair skin. Danielle lived in a condo in Mount Laurel, New Jersey.
She had a tattoo of flowers on her lower back, and she loved Chinese food. Her first passion in life was singing. She loved to perform and listen to music at local bars. It's something that she did part-time from the time she was young. She was often compared to the singer Janis Joplin.
That is a very big compliment.
She worked as a loan processor for a mortgage company, and this job was great for her because she got to work from home, and she really seemed to like it. She was married to Joe Imbo, but they had recently had some pretty serious marriage issues and become separated.
They met at a car dealership where Danielle was working, and they just hit it off. He asked her to quit her band around the time that they got married, and the name of her band was the Schoolboys. That's a rather interesting name of a band.
With a lead singer that was a female. They had a son together, Joe Jr., and he was the center of her life. She described having her son as learning of true love. The marriage, like I said, it recently soured, and the story kind of goes that Joe, her husband, left her with a sick infant and her herself being sick to attend the 2004 Super Bowl. And so that really upset her, as I guess you can imagine. And when he got home, they started to argue, and he told her, hey, look, I found somebody new on the flight to New Orleans for the game. And he left her, and he moved to Georgia with this new woman.
Oh my goodness, that is cold-blooded.
Yes, it is.
Now, I don't necessarily blame him for not wanting to waste Super Bowl tickets because I'm sure they were very expensive.
Yeah, but if she says no, then with a young baby, that's probably not your best bet. The guy in this case is Richard Patron Jr. At the time of his disappearance, he was 35 years old. He was 5 foot 9 inches tall, and he weighed 200 pounds. He was Italian. He had blue eyes and brown hair. He was a big fan of sports. Growing up, he loved to play hockey. That was sort of his passion, as a teenager, etc. And he remained a fan. He was a big fan of the Philadelphia Flyers and the Chicago Bears. I'm sure living in Philadelphia or around Philadelphia and being a Bears fan wasn't always the funnest thing.
I'm surprised the Eagles fans didn't go and give him a couple lickings.
Yeah, but if you go ahead and check out his website, he wore the Bears shirts loud and proud. He wasn't shy about it.
That's admirable, but maybe not the smartest move.
He drove a 2001 black Dodge Dakota that will be a part of this case.
Yeah, this Dodge will come up again, and this is a very interesting piece.
It's one of the things that adds a lot of intrigue to the case because this pickup and what happens with it is just not something that normally happens. So something kind of cool about him is he actually worked at his family's bakery. It was named Viking Pastries, and he attended culinary school to progress his skills. Specifically, he made very elaborate cakes.
He had a tattoo that read the name Angela on his left arm and clowns on his right arm. The tattoo was actually in reference to his 14-year-old daughter, Angela, and he had her when he was 23 years old. Now, Richard Patron Jr. was extremely committed to his daughter. He raised her, he had primary custody of her, but he did allow her to move in with her mother when she got a little older because he thought it would be good for her to be with her mother.
And ironically, that ended up kind of being a blessing, I'm sure, for the family. So let's talk a little bit about Danielle and Richard's relationship. So Richard had a sister. Her name was Christine Petrone, who was friends with Danielle. So they had a mutual connection. They knew each other growing up, but despite her having a crush on him when they were younger, they never did date. One night they were together because of Christine, and they really hit it off.
So they dated for quite a few months, and things were going really well at first, but eventually things got complicated, as they tend to do in relationships. And we know that by this time, her husband, Joe, Mr. I'm going to the Super Bowl no matter what you say. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to leave you as soon as you start an argument with me and run off with another woman. Holy smokes, I still can't get over that. That's insane. Joe, that is really not nice.
He would later say about that, quote, actually I'll modify it just a touch, quote, I effed up.
You certainly did, Joe. You made a very big boo-boo. So by this time, Joe was no longer in the relationship with this other woman. Surprise! And he was back in town, and of course, Jaron, he wanted to rekindle the relationship with Danielle.
Yeah, that's not all that surprising now that he probably had nowhere to live. So this was very stressful for Danielle, and it was just too much for her. So what she decided to do was break up with Richard. You know, she was still separated from her husband, so at this point, she was completely and totally single.
And even though they were separated, they were still technically married.
They were. She expressed that she just wanted to focus on the most important thing to her, which was Joe Jr., her son. And from accounts, this was much harder on Richard than it was Danielle, as he was more emotionally invested in the relationship, but he did accept her wishes and he did not contact her.
So this lasted for 5 weeks, and this actually included a Valentine's Day where they didn't have any contact. So the day we're going to talk about is February 19th, 2005, and this is the day everything happens. Richard was looking to go out for drinks and music, and he called his sister Christine to see if she wanted to go out with him, and she declined. But, interesting enough, she was with Danielle at the time.
And so she asked Danielle, hey, that was my brother. Do you want to go out with him tonight? He's looking for somebody to go to a bar and watch some music. And Danielle said, you know what? Yeah, I'll do that. So just 2 hours later, they met up. They met at a bar named Abilene's. It was on South Street in Philadelphia. If you know anything about Philadelphia, that'd be a little bit like Bourbon Street in New Orleans. It's where a lot of the nightlife is. So they met with his friends, Anthony and Michelle Valentino. They had never met Danielle, but they had heard a lot about her, mostly positive, because again, Richard really liked her.
And they said that they seemed happy. They were hugging, they were kissing. Everything seemed normal, everything was good. They had a few drinks and enjoyed the music, but when they were invited by Anthony to go to another bar for more music, they declined. They said that they both had plans for the morning and didn't want to be too tired.
Very responsible.
Absolutely. Danielle said she had a hair appointment at 11 a.m. at the hair salon where Richard's sister Christine worked at. And she also was to receive her son, Joe Jr., from her husband later that day.
Richard's plans, as a NASCAR fan, was to watch one of the biggest races of the year, the Daytona 500. He planned on having a small party with just some close friends at his place to watch the race. So it was a very cold night that night. And Richard mentioned to his friends that he got really lucky and he got a nearby parking spot. That is the only thing we know that tells us where the truck was in relation to the bar, which is just that it was close. They left with the plan being to drive his black 2001 Dodge Dakota, tags YFH 2319 with a NASCAR emblem on the back, to her home in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. That should have only been about a 35-minute drive, and then after he dropped her off, he was going to return to his home afterwards. Sadly, this, leaving the bar, is the last known location of them.
And keep in mind, this is the last time that truck is seen.
Yeah, in fact, it's unknown even what direction they took when they left the bar. Everything outside of the doors of that bar is unknown.
So the next day, her brother John arrived at her condo because she'd asked him to be there in the morning to work on a curtain rod that Joe Jr. had broken. When he arrived, she wasn't there, and at first he assumed that she stayed with Richard. From what he could tell, she had not been home that night before.
A little later, at 11 a.m., she missed her hair appointment, and people began to kind of worry. Christine called both of them and couldn't get a hold of either her brother Richard or her friend Danielle. But when she missed her appointment at 3:30, where her husband was dropping off Joe Jr., that's when alarm turned to panic. Again, he was the center of her world, and she wouldn't have missed that. Her brother John was there to pick up Joe Jr., and he said, quote, "She wouldn't have missed that, no way." Meanwhile, the Daytona 500 was ran with Jeff Gordon winning, and Richard was not at home, and he was not watching the race. As the families started to panic and call, both phones were going straight to voicemail.
So now the search begins. So John, her brother, and Richard Sr., his dad, spent the whole night, literally the whole night, driving and redriving the routes that they may have taken, checking all side roads. John drove and Richard Sr. searched. They returned at dawn, literally at dawn, and they were exhausted. Unfortunately, they didn't find anything.
So like Zach said, they took every possible route they could think of, which includes a couple different bridges into New Jersey. They took all the side roads. They drove all the areas around the bar. They even asked some people, hey, have you seen this pickup? Hey, have you seen these people?
So not only had nobody seen Danielle or Richard, but they hadn't seen the truck. The truck is big, and that is, you would sure think that somebody would at the very least see their truck.
You know, when you think about it, whether it be a truck or a pickup or a smart car, it doesn't really matter what it is. To lose a car is really, it's easy to find a car. In a city, it can be a little tricky, but when you're searching that hard, you would think that it would be easy to find. Friends also searched surrounding cities for them or the truck, and they came up totally empty-handed. Of course, the thought was, well, maybe they just left. Even though everybody knew that didn't make sense, they didn't know where else to look.
So John actually paid $1,200 to get a Camden police officer to take him up in a helicopter so he could search more area, which is really cool.
It is really cool. And what they were doing is they went up and they went, okay, that might be a black pickup. Let's go check that out. Hey, that looks like whatever. And then when they came down, they spent the rest of the time on foot checking everything they saw.
So even though they had the helicopter and they searched on foot later, nothing was found. At this point, a $100,000 reward was offered for information leading to them, but this reward was never collected. And investigators, 10 officers initially, canvassed the streets but came up with nothing. They looked for security footage on South Street and found nothing. Having said that, there were not many cameras at this time.
Another place they looked was on the toll bridge going to New Jersey, but they were unable to find them. But It's important to note that at that time, the only cameras that were on the bridge were on the inbound side. In other words, they wouldn't have seen them anyways. And a lot of podcasts kind of get this wrong and assume that that means they never crossed the bridge. That's not what that means. They just didn't see them on the bridge, but they probably wouldn't have.
So they also checked the cell phones, their credit cards were monitored, but they never found any use after the disappearance. They were never used again. A tip led investigators to send divers into part of the river along the probable path. And actually, multiple vehicles were found, and one matched the description of his truck. But unfortunately, the VIN was checked, and this truck did not match Richard's vehicle.
Yeah, it's part of the heart-wrenching part of the story. They actually called the families and said, hey, we have a vehicle. They didn't want the media to be how they found out, so they called them and told them, we have a vehicle that matches the description. There's a good chance that that's it. It was a black Dodge Dakota, but when they pulled it, they checked the VIN, they checked the registration, and it wasn't the same pickup. What are the odds of that?
The odds of that are not very good, and my heart goes out to the family because I can't even imagine how high their hopes got that maybe they found something and they can give them a proper burial. And then they were crushed after it turned out to be a dead end.
So here's a kind of strange part of the story. A sidekick actually got a hold of John and told him, quote, your sister is being held in a boxcar of a train in Philadelphia. You have to act now or your sister will be gone forever. So John, desperate to find his sister, freaks out and he calls Ed Pincus, who was the head of the investigation at the time. And he said, hey, I just got this tip, we'll call it. I'm heading down there to check it out right now. And Ed told him, you've got to stop this. You're going crazy. But mainly out of concern for John, not wanting him to become injured or whatever, he did send cops and they did search boxcars in the area, but they didn't find anything, unsurprisingly. And beyond this point, psychics were totally ignored.
So John sounds like a very good man who's doing everything he can to find his sister. And the psychic calls him. Clearly there's nothing to it, but I can't blame him for doing everything he can to try to locate his sister.
Just to take a moment to focus on what a piece of work you have to be as that psychic, that phony, to call John and tell him something like that. It is just, it's sick.
That is appalling. I agree completely. So, law enforcement interviewed friends and family, and this included Anthony, who, keep in mind, was with them at the bar. But he passed a polygraph test, and absolutely nothing was found from these interviews. So, after 3 weeks, the FBI took over the search.
When the FBI took over, they performed extensive investigations into both of their pasts because most likely you would find something. You would assume that maybe it was a hit, maybe they had drugs in their past, whatever. But they didn't find anything at all that would make them a target. The only thing that seemed suspicious was her divorce, so her husband.
So Joe Imbo, we know as her, technically still her husband, he did have a rock-solid alibi that night. He was at a party that actually included many police officers. He, however, did have a few issues, and phone records showed that he had been in contact with Richard, even calling him at the family bakery. And it is said that he later threatened him to stay away from his wife, and he later admitted that he didn't have much love for Joe. Now, having said this, I can't necessarily blame the guy for this.
Yeah, taken in context, it really isn't that big of a deal. If they had not disappeared that night, nobody'd think anything of it. This is not that unusual. Another thing that police found suspicious, or the FBI in this case, was that he did access her voicemail a few times. They could tell that through phone records. But he just said, well, I was just jealous. And it was a bad decision, but I was jealous, and that's why I did that.
It's said that Joe came to her condo and things did get heated, possibly including him throwing a high chair at the wall. And her brother John actually had to call Joe and tell him to keep it civil. We do know that Joe took a polygraph test, but the results are unknown to the public.
We also know that a grand jury was summoned, which is fairly routine in a case like this, but no action was ever taken. And for being the only real suspect, there really isn't much tying him to the case, if anything at all.
So, where the case stands now, FBI Special Agent Vito Rizzelli, who is the investigator in charge of the case, said, quote, making 2 people and a truck disappear with no witnesses and no evidence of any kind for 9 years suggests methodical planning.
Another quote is, it's possible a perpetrator could just get lucky. It's more likely just what it looks like. Somebody behind this knew what they were doing. And again, the key here is 2 people, very unusual, and the truck disappearing, very unusual. They have ruled out kidnapping, and they think a random act of violence is very unlikely. So they held a press conference, and they said that it's being investigated as a double homicide, possibly a murder for hire. They later stated, though, that this was mainly to shake the tree.
Because they clearly at this point didn't have any leads to go off, and they were just grasping at straws.
More or less, I believe they, for the lack of a better term, hoped Joe did it and hoped that he would fess up to it or get scared and tell somebody. In fact, Joe once said that they point blank said, hey, we know you did this. Just admit it.
So John said, quote, not a lipstick, not a bag, not a shoe, not a car, not an eyewitness, not a tip, not anything. And Sergeant Tim Cooney of the Philadelphia Police said, quote, no one is a suspect and everyone is a subject of this investigation. So to me, Jaron, I'll get your opinion. This just means they have nowhere to look.
Yeah, everybody is a subject to investigation. I agree. They have nobody. So let's talk about a few of the rumored suspects. There's a man named Robert Carey. He allegedly led a prescription pill ring in the area. And on the streets, it was rumored that he was the hitman on this crime. You know how rumors are. So later, he killed himself in prison, and he left a note that was rumored, again, a rumor, to address the case, but it seems that's untrue. There's people that claim they met people that read the note, and they denied that it had anything to do with this case at all.
So that kind of looks like a dead end to me. Another person of interest is Anthony Rodesky. And Anthony was a big, mean man with a swastika tattoo on his bald head. Anthony, that's very interesting to say the least. I'm not sure what his thought process was there. And Anthony murdered 2 men in the course of separate robberies. So this is not a good man we're talking about here. They did actually dig up his basement, and they searched his home and even his septic tank, but they didn't find anything.
And I would really hate to be the man assigned to searching his septic tank.
Oh, goodness. I second that.
Realistically, neither Anthony nor Robert are good candidates at all for this crime. So what are our theories and what are the possibilities? Let's talk about the possibilities here. Could they have drove into the river?
I personally think that this is a very big possibility. It was late at night.
They had been drinking.
This is personally my favorite possibility because that would explain a lot. It would explain the lack of motive. it would explain that there's simply no evidence, there's nothing to go off of at this point.
And it would also explain the big one, the truck.
Certainly, because it's in a huge body of water that isn't clean by any means, and it's very difficult to search.
And it seems abstract to hear, well, they may have drove into the river, but it actually happens more than people think it happens. If you drain almost any river across America, you will find cars in it that they didn't know were in it.
And one of these days, I will get one of those cars and fix it up.
Another option, carjacking. Zach, what are your thoughts on that?
It's certainly possible because they did have a really bad chop shop problem in the city around the time they went missing. But personally, Jaron, I would think that when police came out with the $100,000 offer, if somebody knew about this, they would have gladly talked.
And the investigators have conveyed that same opinion, that they think the $100,000 would have been enough to drive one of these really petty criminals, out of the darkness into the light, collect their $100,000 and say, yeah, we chopped that car up.
Oh, certainly. So, Jaron, what do you think about Joe Sr.? What are your thoughts on him?
Well, again, just to talk about what was going on there, they were going through a divorce, and he was very angry that she was dating Richard. They had exchanged words, even as going as far as to calling him at his place of work, which is a pretty low move. But he had a rock-solid alibi, by all accounts, and this was a spontaneous meeting, so it would have been really hard in a murder-for-hire situation to have planned that.
And I personally am not a huge fan of this, but we will bring it up for argument's sake. Jaron, do you think it's possible that they just decided to run away together?
Yeah, I think we share this opinion. There's no chance that happened. First of all, she was maybe less into this relationship than him, and they both were very, very, very committed parents. There's just no chance that they ran away.
I agree with that. So, as we come to the conclusion of the episode, sadly, I'm not sure that the case will ever be solved. I do think that there's potential because I think it's very likely that the truck is on the bottom of the Delaware River, but it's certainly a possibility and unfortunately likely that nothing will come of this.
Her family still holds out hope that she is alive. The Petrones, his family, it's sad, but they had actually accepted that he probably passed away by Tuesday after they went missing, so that's 2 days. Another really sad thing here is that the families used to be fairly close. Again, we talked about on the first day of them missing, they were searching together. The families were pretty tight, but they no longer talk because, as you can kind of expect, her family thinks, well, what's Richard have in his past that got our daughter killed? And his family thinks, well, her husband Joe killed our son. An interesting representation of this relationship breaking down is richardpetrone.com is still up. DanielleImbo.com is still up. They're very different websites, clearly ran by different people. And richardanddanielle.com is no longer up.
That is a very sad situation that coming from this event, families no longer talk and there's just a bunch of unneeded drama from it, which sucks.
So currently that $100,000 reward is no longer on the table, but the FBI is offering a reward of up to $15,000 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of anyone involved in the disappearance of Danielle Imbo and Richard Petrone. If you have any information concerning this person, please contact your local FBI office or the nearest American embassy or consulate. You can also submit an anonymous tip online to the FBI at fbi.gov.
And if you know anything about it, or possibly you've seen a truck that matches that description, and keep in mind he did have a NASCAR bumper sticker on the back, come forward with it, please. So this is the conclusion of this episode about the disappearance of Danielle Embo and Richard Patron Jr. We hope everybody enjoyed the episode. Thank you for listening. If you have any tips or suggestions, future cases you'd like us to cover, we'd love to hear from you. Please check out our Facebook page and our Twitter page at Podcast Criminal. And tell your friends about us. If you'd be so kind, please subscribe to our podcast and leave us reviews. It would certainly go a long ways in helping the growth of our podcast. Again, thank you very much for listening to us, and everybody have a fantastic day.
And remember, keep your record clean and your prints off the scene.